Ready. So the type of attack we're going to talk about is called a DNS amplification attack, and it's a type of DDoS attack. And how a DDoS attack works is we have the attacker and they flood the victim's network traffic. And so the amplification attack involves a DNS server, which this is how a DNS server works. A client will send a request to the DNS server with asking where a certain domain is. The DNS server is going to respond to the client with the location of the server.
So the way a DNS amplification attack incorporates both of these elements is first you've got your attacker over here and your victim. So what the attacker does is it sends a request over to a DNS server, and instead of putting its own return address on the request, it spoofs it and puts the victim's attack address instead. And whereas before you only asked for the location of a domain, in these attacks they usually ask for all the details that a DNS server holds inside of their database. So when the DNS server returns when the DNS responds to the request and sends it over to the victim, the information has grown considerably, hence its name, amplification attack.
All right, so Poe gave a little intro to DDoS and DNS attacks and how they work together to do DNS amplification attacks, but just as a little bit of a recap and a little bit more detail, a DNS amplification attack is made possible because of one facet of DNS and one type of DNS. There's basically two types. There's authoritative DNS and there's recursive DNS. Authoritative DNS is like your root servers on the internet or a root server in an organization that has the authority to resolve an IP address with a domain name. That's why it's called an authoritative DNS. So those ones receive a request and know exactly where the address is and return it to whoever requested it. A recursive DNS is a little bit different. Recursive DNS holds a large array or a list of possible addresses that it's seen, and if it doesn't have the requested IP address in that list, it pushes off the request to another DNS server until it gets to a root and receives down the chain the requested IP address it's looking for. So that's why it's called recursive, is it looks to itself first and then goes to another one, receives the request eventually, and then sends it back to the client. The problem is when you send a request to a recursive DNS server, it responds, the request it sends back is its full cache of IP addresses. So that's what makes amplification possible, and we call it an amplification factor. A recursive DNS server has an amplification factor of 20 to 40 times the original request size. So rather than just sending a request of 42 bytes and receiving a request of 42 bytes, you can send a request for 42 bytes and receive hundreds of bytes in return. So the problem with this is there's open recursive DNS servers on the internet or within an organization, and if an attacker can access those, they can spoof an IP address and say that they are coming from an address other than the one they really are. So they choose a target and spoof that IP address, send a request to the DNS recursive server, and then tons of packets. The packets are amplified and sent back to the victim address, and it effectively operates like a regular DDoS attack at that point where it just can't handle the traffic. So that's made possible because of these open DNS servers. So right now we're going to show you how to disable that. We have right here Windows Server 2012. It's a pretty simple process. We go into Administrative Tools, select DNS, and we're going to select our DNS server, click on Properties, and then Advanced, and then it's really just as simple as checking this Disable Recursion feature. When you do that and apply, and then press OK, we're now protected from recursive lookup on this DNS server.
Okay, so now that we've disabled recursion on our DNS server, the next thing we need to do is disable root hints. What happens is when a user sends a request to our DNS server, the DNS server no longer responds with a cache of all of our DNS lookups. Instead, it'll send a response of authoritative domain names you can go to. These are called root hints, and we'll want to disable that because even still with root hints, it can have an amplification factor of 10 times. So we'll want to disable that. The way we'll do that is go into our properties on our server, go into root hints, and you can see a list of all of your authoritative domain names. So what you can do is you can go into PowerShell, make sure to open it up as a administrator. Let me click out of that. Run as administrator, and then the command you'll need to enter in is set DNS server forwarder use root hint, and then set that to false. And when you run that, that's going to disable all of these root hints that we had earlier on in our setting. And then instead of having a 10 times amplification factor, our request will only send a 1-to-1 response and remove that threat of DNS amplification attacks.